Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today, we've reached the last of our bad ideas in the current series, and this is one that connects to something we've been talking about a lot in 2024, American presidential elections. I'm going to try to persuade Gary Gerstle that televised leadership debates are a really bad idea. I'm not sure he's entirely convinced, but it's not just about America. Nick Clegg and Cleggmania get a mention too in the case against. Gary, let me be honest up front. The reason we're doing this as the last bad idea in our series is actually it's nagged away at me a bit ever since we recorded our post-election analysis and all our other thoughts thrown in too. And after we'd finished, I thought the one thing that we hadn't mentioned was the fact that after Trump won, it made that debate with Harris seem not just irrelevant, but kind of weird in the sense that there was a consensus. Trump didn't buy into the consensus, but even some of the people around him bought into the consensus that the debate with Harris had been something of a disaster for him. And though he said afterwards his reason for not doing another one was that he'd won so comfortably, he didn't need to do another one. It was clear he was not going to put himself through that again. And he had been, if those debates do anything, he had been exposed. And yet it just seemed to vanish into the ether after the result happened. What was the point of that? So we're going to talk about the history of these debates and try and unpack a little bit why they started, what they teach us, what they don't teach us. But part of the reason why I think they've gone a bit wrong is this year, and we'll come back at the end to the debate with Biden, which clearly was consequential. But this year, it was like a joke. What was the point of that debate?
Well, I think there was a point to the debate, actually, in the sense that Harris clobbered Trump. And significantly after the debate, her clobbering of Trump raised her poll numbers. And so if there had been a second debate, I think this might have given her an opportunity to raise her poll numbers some more and may have pushed her over the finishing line. It's possible to imagine that, which is precisely why I think Trump decided not to give her another debate. Now, the question for this moment is, have we come to the end of the era of presidential debates that began arguably in 1960 and has more to do with the changing media landscape than with what actually goes on in the debates itself? Because it seems that the key event in terms of publicity, in terms of exposing candidates to the public, was not the debate, but it was the Joe Rogan 3-hour podcast interview that Trump gave him and that Harris refused to give him. I think the debate between Trump and Harris drew 66 million watchers at its peak, and the Rogan podcast was downloaded by 50 million Americans, almost no difference there. It may be that the one reason why the debate faded into the ether was because it's deemed not authentic enough, too ritualized, too stylized, too performative for an era of podcasting and social media and authenticity, however we may want to define that.
And yet he was authentically awful in it. And you say it's very interesting. I hadn't really thought about it. Had there been a second debate and a third debate? There were a second and third debates in 2016, and he was authentically pretty awful in those too. And it didn't make that much difference. But that one this year was worse, I think, than the debates against Hillary. You made the point at the time, which is it did serve a purpose for Trump because he got people talking about eating dogs and cats in Illinois. And that, as I said at the time, that's the literal dead cat strategy. But nonetheless, I still am slightly taken aback by the extent to which, with hindsight, the deeply unpresidential nature of his performance didn't make any difference. So maybe a second debate and a third debate would have, and as you said, it made a bit of difference in poll numbers, but it certainly didn't it came out in the wash. And it does make me wonder, and this is what, in a way, we're going to talk about, whether these debates create a set of expectations around an idea of what would be a presidential performance, which is now obsolete or outdated, maybe for the reasons you said. There's a notion of authenticity that goes way beyond competence. But did they ever, part of my question, let's go back to 1960. They've served different functions at different times. But did they ever really do the job? This is my question, that in the hype around them they're meant to do, which is this is the ultimate test of these two candidates, and it shows the voters, gives the voters a chance to really assess not just how they feel about them, but how they react in real time to a performance under pressure in which they do get a chance. It's a debate to put arguments and counter arguments and so on. Has it ever delivered on that promise? So did it deliver on that promise in 1960? There are a lot of myths around the Kennedy-Nixon debates. What do you think really happened then? What was revealed and what wasn't revealed in those contests?
I think the 1960 debate did matter. Before I get to that, let me just say one more thing about Trump. It's not just that his debate performance didn't matter. Think about all the other things that didn't matter. His infidelity, his convictions, his January 6th storming of the Capitol. It's hard to extract the debate performance from that larger record of misbehavior that an awful lot of Americans didn't seem to really care about at all. So it's hard to extract a debate from that. We'll come back to that later, I'm sure.
And I totally take that point in a way. Hanging a bad idea on Trump is probably a bad idea because he may be the thing that makes previous judgments of these things obsolete. We'll come back to that. Let's go back to 1960, though, because there is a really interesting history behind these debates and the different role they've played in different campaigns. What do you think the significance of 1960 was?
Well, this was between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon at the time was a much better known figure in national politics. He had been vice president for 2 terms of Eisenhower. He had risen to fame during the anti-communist crusade of the late 40s and early 50s. He had a reputation as a very skilled debater, public presence, extraordinary knowledge of foreign policy. Kennedy was the son of a very rich man who wanted to make one of his sons president of the United States. He did not have a particularly distinguished senatorial career, but he had tremendous amount of charisma, and he was making strides in the 1960 campaign. And this was when TV broadcasting was becoming popular to the point of every American family having a TV in their home. And so the two men engaged in the first presidential debate of the nominees of either party ever. There had been a very famous debate between 2 would-be presidential nominees in 1858, Lincoln and Douglas, but that was for a senatorial campaign. It was not for the presidency itself.
And with that one, you had to be there or read about it. Those are the only 2 ways you could experience it.
That's correct. And each man spoke for hours, a very untelegenic form of debating. And we can talk about that later. So 1960 technically and technologically represented a very real departure. And Kennedy bested Nixon in the first debate through his glamour and through his comfort in front of the television camera. And Nixon had a bead of sweat glistening on his chin. And if you were to watch a clip now, which you can do, that was concerning. But even more concerning were the shiftiness of his eyes, constantly moving back and forth. This was a man utterly unprepared for the television age. And it happened to be that Kennedy was, by his natural abilities and glamour and charisma, more suited for a television audience. And this was a very closely fought election. And it is thought that that first debate convinced enough undecided voters to give Kennedy a much closer look. And it's not as though his reputation for glamour and charisma was born in the debate. It was tremendously enhanced in the debate. And so it gave him an edge and an opportunity that he had not previously had. For those who listened on the radio to the debate, the conviction was that Nixon had the better argument. He had the better fund of knowledge. Those who could not see him were much more inclined to come away thinking that he was the winner of that debate. But this was a television event, gala event, and it's the TV presentations that mattered the most.
And there were, I think, 3 subsequent debates between them. And Nixon, who was a quick learner and also willing to criticize himself, recognized what he'd got wrong. And he looked different. He dressed differently. It's thought that he performed better, but something about the first debate stuck in people's consciousness. But my question with this is, in a way, how much, and it relates to other debates too, how much of how we read these things is with hindsight? Because as you say, it was an incredibly close election. There is a view that Kennedy's father may have helped him over the line with practices that wouldn't stand up to too much scrutiny. But we are talking about small numbers of either legitimate or illegitimate votes. Like many elections that are very close, it could have gone the other way. And had it gone the other way, wouldn't we be telling a story now about how, yes, the first debate seemed to boost Kennedy's profile, but the subsequent ones brought Nixon back into the contest and showed that he did have the better grasp and so on, and that we would tell a different story about the significance of these debates, because we do tend to retrofit the story to the outcome of the election. I think this will be true of some of the other ones we're going to talk about too. In such a fine election, it's almost been mythologized, I think. You do get polling movements after debates, as we got in 2024. Harris went up. You get polling movements after lots of things during campaigns. But the election itself, if it's very close, it's quite hard to argue, I think, that one particular event changed the dynamic. And yet this debate did seem to set in train the idea that a good debate could win you or lose you the presidency. I'm not sure I've ever believed that.
Well, the challenge for us, which we're not going to solve in our discussion today, is that it's impossible to give a definitive answer that Kennedy won or lost a debate on the basis of his television performance. I do think that this signaled a new era of politics where politicians had to pay much more attention to how they came across visually through a TV screen than they had ever had to do before. And it meant that they also had to think a lot harder about certain attributes that went with that kind of visualization, which they didn't have to think about during the era of radio. I think what does emerge from this debate is the sense in a very close election, when the margins are understood to be very small, something like a debate can make enough of a difference with enough undecided voters so as to push them into the other party's column. And I think it would be a mistake to say that didn't happen in 1960. We can't prove that it happened definitively, but I think given the closeness of the vote, given the suspicion and uncertainty about Kennedy, one of the issues he had to deal with in terms of not trusting him when he was trying to be and then became the first Catholic president of the United States. And it's hard now to recall the intensity of anti-Catholic sentiment in the United States, but it was very intense. So his ability to show that he was a normal guy, charismatic guy, vision for America, that America might be great under his leadership, arguably made enough of a difference to swing the election to him. But the margin was very, very slight. And it's not to suggest that this was decisive. It's better to see this as the advisors to the president understanding that television debates opened up an opportunity for a candidate to reach groups of voters they had not been able to reach and to bring enough of them into his column so as to get him over the finish line.
When I was reading about the history of debates, I hadn't been aware, because I was conscious of the fact that 1960 was a kind of watershed, that there wouldn't be another presidential debate until 1976. Now, Nixon himself obviously fought two more elections, 68 and 72. I'm guessing partly scarred by his experience in 1960, but also the thing that became clear quite early on is that debates are good for certain kinds of candidates and not good for others, not just good for telegenic, not good for sweaty, shifty-eyed candidates, but good for the underdog, the person who's coming from behind, much more to lose for the candidate who is favored to win or is fighting a more defensive campaign or is trying to shore up a coalition rather than reach new voters. And for the next 16 years, the mismatch of incentive was enough, I think, to prevent there being further debate. So we have to, for a presidential debate, there were, of course, other debates for other kinds of roles, and the debates became more routine for senatorial races and other things. But a debate, a nationwide debate between the two candidates for president of the two main parties, wasn't going to happen again until 76. Am I right to be surprised by that, given how important this event seemed to be at the time?
I think you're right to be surprised if this ushered in a dramatically new era of televised politics.
Yeah, where was it?
Where was it in 1964, 68, and 1972? And as happens with political professionals everywhere. They're always calculating, is this going to be an advantage for our candidate or is this going to be a disadvantage? And the rule of thumb that develops is if one candidate is far enough ahead, they shouldn't risk a debate because precisely because there's an unpredictable element to a debate. Something could happen at that debate that could change the algorithm for the election. And if you're way ahead, why risk that? Well, in 64, Johnson was way ahead of Goldwater. There was no chance of Johnson giving Goldwater a platform. The expectation was that Nixon was going to be way ahead in 68. That turned out not to be the case, but I'm sure he felt somewhat scarred by the 1960 experience, and he was going to avoid that kind of debate if he could. And in 72, the expectation was again that Nixon was so far in front of McGovern that there was no point in giving McGovern a platform where something unforeseen might change the progress of the election. There's one other element that comes into play here. It's a technical element, but it's important, and that it has to do with very abstruse rules governing American elections that every candidate had to be given equal time. Well, what does this mean for a third-party candidate who wants to get airtime? It could have been someone in 68. It could have been someone in 1972. And the rules were such that if the debates were to go forward, if there was a serious third-party candidate, he was going to have a legitimate claim on participating in the debates. And neither of the dominant parties wanted the wild card of a third-party candidate. The rules have to be adjusted in 1976 in order for the debate between Ford and Carter to go forward, and the adjustments will be made in the 1980s as well. So there's a technical element to this as well. That's not to say the technical element couldn't have been overcome sooner in the 1960s, but it was there and it had to be dealt with and had to be finessed so as to allow the debate to be simply between the candidates of the two major parties.
And I completely get why neither of the main parties would want to share a platform, say, with George Wallace. They would be jointly incentivized to avoid that. We'll come on to the issue of three-way candidate debates because there's a very interesting UK example later on in this story. In 1976, I suppose you could say, in a slightly unusual way, it was a rare election in which both candidates were underdogs, in the sense that Gerald Ford had inherited the presidency after Watergate under extremely inauspicious circumstances. He was not a particularly glamorous or charismatic politician, but Jimmy Carter was a relative unknown, and outside he had to introduce himself to the American public. So one can see why, in that case, the incentive structure lined up for these two. I also noticed reading about this, that this debate, and indeed the subsequent debates in 1980 and 1984, was sponsored by the League of Women Voters, which is an interesting fact. I don't know whether there was some thought that debates were a way to introduce the candidates to women voters because they wouldn't come across them in other ways, but this is one of the features of this. But the other feature of this period is, unlike in 1960, where the idea was, it wasn't that Nixon had said anything stupid. In fact, as you said, people who listen on the radio are reputed to have thought that he bested Kennedy in the argument, but it's not like Kennedy made a gaffe either. From 76 onwards, we've entered the era where the real focus in presidential debates is, has anyone gaffed? Is there a line for which the debate will be remembered? I don't think there's a line in 1960. I'm not aware of it, that people go, yeah, that's the debate in which Kennedy said X or Y. They remember his inaugural and so on, but they don't remember the debate. But in 76, there was a gaffe, which we'll come on to. And then when we get onto the debates that Reagan had with Carter and then with Mondale, there were these kind of zingers, these lines that were thought to have landed. And after the debate, a lot of the analysis became about, is there the moment rather than the look, the bead of sweat, but the thing that was said, the gaffe or the zinger, which again, I'm the person who suggested this as a bad idea. I'm not sure it's a huge advance in democratic politics, the relentless pursuit of the gaffe or the zinger. But that's the era we entered in 76, isn't it?
Yes. Gerald Ford makes a huge gaffe in the 1976 debate. They were talking about foreign policy and they got onto the threat of the Soviet Union and threat of communism. And he says, without blinking, and his face is full on the camera. It's like he's almost at the other side of your living room in your home. So it's unmistakable. He says there is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration. Okay, this is 1976. The Soviet Union completely dominates Eastern Europe. I don't know exactly what was in Gerald Ford's mind, but he there was a follow-up question from one of the moderators, incredulous. President Ford, did I hear this correctly? And he doubled down on it, and he began in a way that might have led him out of the dead end, the cul-de-sac into which he had moved himself by saying, by mentioning Yugoslavia, which of course was not under Soviet control, but then he went on to Romania, and then he went on to Poland, which were under Soviet control, despite the fact that there were dissenters. You may have been thinking about the dissenters in these countries. There may have been the germ of an idea, and he wanted to support the dissenters. And probably someone on his policy team said to him, we must give the dissenters in these countries some kind of hope and the sense that America will stand with them. But it came out all wrong. And Gerald Ford was a good man and an intelligent man, but not quick on his feet. He just had no way of moving out of this moment, this situation. And the consensus at the time was that this gave a little-known governor of Georgia by the name of Jimmy Carter an opportunity to make a case for himself that otherwise he would have had a much tougher time making. So the gaffe as offering an opening, and then this began the era, not so much of gaffes, but as understand it as a era of gaffes and zingers, that these moments, Reagan had two of them, one in 1980 and 1984, and we can discuss the details of them if you want to. The 1984 one is just hilarious and quite wonderful, and I replayed the clip for myself every time I listen to it. You have to do what his opponent did at that moment, Walter Mondale, just break out in a smile and start laughing because it was such a brilliant intervention. But these zingers are what the debates come to be remembered for. Interesting that you should mention the League of Women Voters. This has actually a distinguished history behind it. And we ought to talk for a moment about, well, why debates in the first place? And there is a good rationale for them. You have two candidates. You want to hear them go after each other on the issues. And who can be trusted to make sure they stay with the issues? Well, the League of Women Voters. Why the League of Women Voters? This goes back to the 1920s. This goes back to the fight for women's suffrage in America and the belief that men had just made a mess of politics. They were preternaturally corrupt. They had egos that were ridiculously overinflated. They could not be trusted to conduct democratic politics as it needed to be conducted in America. So let's bring in women who don't have these egos, who don't have the same inclination for corruption, who the country has already entrusted with the most important task for a republic, the inculcation of civic virtue in the next generation of citizens, male citizens, children. So let's just extend their domain from the private realm to the public realm. Let's let them oversee elections. Let's let them organize these debates, and they will bring a kind of seriousness to it, and they will encourage what all democracies want, which is serious deliberation and discussion about the affairs of the day and the issues of the day that matter. So there's actually something wonderful about the League of Women Voters still being involved in this 50 years after suffrage and trying to make the point that these men must be held to account. And there's no better force in the world that can do that than educated, serious women who just have a greater capacity for virtue than these sorry men. And that was the impetus behind this. So it's the road to debates. In other words, David, it may be a bad idea, but it's paved with good intentions.
It absolutely is, but they didn't get serious debate. They got gaffes and zingers and soundbites. There was serious debate too. And actually, I think it's thought that Ford acquitted himself pretty well in the domestic policy debate, and he got the better of Carter, did him no good because he made this gaffe. And so the focus shifted inevitably after that gaffe to a kind of gotcha politics, and coaching these candidates. I think the word is that Henry Kissinger was involved. He may have overbriefed Gerald Ford and given him too much to think about, and that was what went wrong there. But nonetheless, it's not remembered for the policy discussion. It's remembered for the moment where something else was revealed, and I don't downplay the significance of this. You are seeing how these candidates cope under pressure. You're seeing their ability to think on their feet, particularly having dug a hole. Will they carry on digging or will they climb out? That's quite an important presidential attribute, though it's by no means the only one, and it doesn't line up with the original good intentions behind these debates. By the time we get to Reagan in 84, we should probably tell people what the brilliant line is. I remember it, but my memory of it, I haven't rewatched it, but my memory of it was very scripted in the sense that this wasn't some spontaneous act of wit. He delivered it well because he was an actor. He was also a great politician. I'm not downplaying the fact he was a great politician. But in these debates, he did fall back on his more Hollywood skills. It felt, my memory of it, a little scripted. And after all, the issue at stake was he too old? It all looks a little bit quaint in hindsight, given what's about to happen in January, and indeed what happened 4 years ago when Joe Biden became president. Was Reagan too old for a second term? There were rumors that he was losing a bit of cognitive function. Turns out the rumors were true. So the other thing about this soundbite is it did actually conceal a certain truth. I mean, maybe debates can't be expected to reveal those truths. So in one famous instance this year, it did. So I'm a little more wary of celebrating that Reagan moment. It is the thing that debate, that entire campaign is remembered for, but as a way of putting to bed the question, the entirely legitimate question, does this man have the beginnings of what is going to become dementia? It was a successful but not entirely noble response.
No, not noble at all. I mean, the League of Women Voters didn't get the debate they wanted because this is a story of media conquering the best of intentions, of deliberative democracy, right? Something that we've been struggling with in one form or another ever since. Reagan's line was completely scripted, although he did not share it with anyone. His advisors were very nervous. And the backdrop to this is that there was a first debate where he was simply out to lunch, not quite as out to lunch as Biden was in June 2024. But if you watch elements of that first debate, quite close. He is not present in a meaningful way for large stretches of that. And this caused a crisis in Reagan headquarters. And there was the understanding that a second debate, he had to find a way to diffuse this. So my admiration for what he said is not so much that this was great for democracy, it's just an admiration for his skills as a politician. And I forget what the prompt was for him, but what he said was, I will not make age an issue in this campaign. He was 73 at the time, by the way, not 78 like Trump or 81 like Biden. He said, I will not make an age an issue in this campaign. I will not for a moment exploit my opponent's youth and inexperience. Perfectly delivered. It's a great line. And what does it show? It shows that a great line, perfectly delivered, can have the impact in these televised debates that candidates are looking for. Walter Mondale was his Democratic opponent, and he had gained measurably in the polls after that first debate because there were so many doubts about Reagan. Mondale himself would later say that this was the moment where his momentum stalled and Reagan resumed his march to the presidency. And the 1984 became one of the great landslide elections in all of American politics. And it had the effect of certifying that Reagan was a major political player in America and that his Reagan revolution was going to happen. So that is acknowledged as a turning point in the debate. And I agree with you fully. There were signs of Alzheimer's, of dementia, that became quite pronounced, especially in the second 2 years of his second presidency, from 1986 to 88, or better to say that 87 to the beginning of 1989. And he lost competence. He should not have been president at that point. There should have been a moment in that campaign where the issue of his mental competence could have been opened up and investigated more thoroughly. And so in that respect, the debate did not serve the purpose it needed to serve if we're concerned about good governance.
I want to fast forward to 2000, actually, not because there weren't debates, significant ones in the intervening years. In 1992, there was a celebrated, notorious debate, a town hall, and it was a three-way contest in 92. So the two leading parties did agree to allow Ross Perot on the stage. And in the town hall format, Bill Clinton was a master. And again, if you watch the YouTube videos of that, he was brilliant at the thing. He started the trend, which became insufferable, including in British politics, of addressing the questioner by that person's name and really locking eyes with that person and talking as though it was just that person whose question he wanted to take seriously. George H.W. Bush was uncomfortable in that format, and his His gaffe was actually more like Nixon in the sense it was almost physical rather than verbal. It was a non-verbal signal. He looked at his watch in that debate. He was sitting on his little bar stool and he looked at his watch. And that was a terrible look because it looked like while Clinton was empathizing with ordinary Americans, the patrician George H.W. Bush was bored. So that served him no good. He was probably going to lose anyway. His son, George W. Bush, in 2000, had a series of debates with Al Gore. And part of the significance of those, I think, is they became the basis for a very influential book called The Political Brain that was published by a political scientist, political psychologist called Drew Weston, who analyzed those debates in order to illustrate what he thought was a very, very important point about political communication, because he took the Bush-Gore debates to be emblematic of a contest between an explainer, which is what Gore was, we might say a wonk, someone who really believed that the facts were what was important, and a storyteller, which is what George W. Bush was. And seen from one perspective, Gore seemed to get the better of him, and he dominated aspects of those debates. But if you assume, as Weston does, that in the end, what the political brain of the ordinary voter wants to hear is stories, not facts, actually it illustrated the fatal mistake that progressives often make. Bill Clinton didn't make that mistake because he was a great storyteller, but Al Gore wasn't. Now, my problem with that analysis is this does seem to me an example of where an election result is used to retrofit an argument. And in this case, what I don't like about it is the election, it wasn't just close. I mean, Gore won. He just had it taken away from him by the Supreme Court. Or if he didn't win, he as close as damn it won. And had it gone a tiny bit the other way, had all the votes in Florida been counted, would we still be making this argument? So I do, to go back to what I said earlier, I do have that slight wariness about people wanting to tell a story about presidential campaigns because we like stories, in which debates become this central feature. I'm sure Weston has a point in his analysis, but I think it was overstated. And George W. Bush was pretty stiff and unconvincing in those debates too. He wasn't that great a storyteller. He just didn't have any facts at his fingertips in the way that Gore did. I'm suspicious of that one as being overdetermined as an explanation.
Well, I don't like Weston's argument that much for precisely the reasons you've articulated. Bush is not a great storyteller.
Clinton was a far better storyteller.
Far better storyteller. But I do think that the debate mattered in this way. It's true, we can agree, perhaps, that Gore actually won that election if all the votes had been fairly counted and the Supreme Court had not short-circuited the recounting of the votes that had to happen for plainly and cynically partisan reasons. But one can make an argument that given the success of the Clinton administration and the popularity of Clinton, that it should not have been that close. That Gore was presidential timber of the best sort. And it was just so obvious that to so many people, that George W. Bush was the very privileged son of a very distinguished Republican family across generations, who had spent most of his life wandering around, not achieving very much of anything on his own, that he did not have a lot of help with. So one could argue that it should not have been that close in 2000, and we can talk about reasons for why it became as close as it did. I would say what hurt Gore was not the reference constantly to facts and figures. I think what hurt Gore was his demonstrated arrogance, that he could not believe he was sharing the stage with someone who he so plainly regarded as his intellectual and political inferior. And you can hear him sighing audibly when Bush is talking. Even worse, if you look at him while Bush is talking, his eyes are just expressions of disbelief. And can you believe this idiot who I'm sharing the stage with? And given the populist tenor of American politics, Americans don't like to see that. And I remember one debate in particular where I watched Gore engage, not quite gyrations, but just so visibly demonstrating his contempt for Bush. And I'm thinking, this is not good. This is not going over very well at all. And then I had occasion, because I was worried about, after that debate, I was worried about the election. I was driving back from Washington to New Jersey, Princeton, where I was living at the time. I had time on my hands, and I said, let me listen to this debate again. And I had the JFK Nixon experience of 1960 on the radio, Gore demolished Bush in that debate, but visually, he lost it. So this was another example of Gore not understanding the medium that he had to use in order to be a successful candidate. So I think he lost an advantage that he could have turned to his advantage. He never would have been a great storyteller, but he became a better storyteller. After he lost the election, I remember the stories he was telling about climate catastrophe in the first decade of the 21st century, which were very effectively done. He was still is an enormously talented man. Oh, I don't know how old he is and what he's doing now, but a man of enormous talents. But he did not grasp the moment or understand the circumstances, and he was not strategizing as he needed to strategize to win. How do you win a debate against an opponent you have contempt for? How do you do that? I think that question did not get asked. So I think the debate mattered. And I think the way to think about that election is, and this was the expectation at a certain point, that given the wind at his back from the Clinton administration, that it should not have been so close that a few hundred votes in Florida was going to decide the election.
How do you win a debate against an opponent you have contempt for? Harris gave a pretty good case study in how you do that. Fat lot of good it did her, but that's the way you do it. And she, I suspect, had learned some of the lessons even from 2000 about eye rolling and the rest. There was a moment in those debates, again, a standout moment that tends to be remembered. George W. Bush had a kind of frat boy sense of humor, and there's a little bit of physical comedy about him. I think there was always a bit of physical comedy about him. And there was a point where Gore was hovering behind him and he did a kind of shuddery jump as though he'd been spooked by this slightly creepy man hanging around behind him. And it captured something. It was one of those rare elections where the shorter candidate won. I think it's pretty unusual.
Yes, a ridiculous fact of American politics that the tall candidate always tends to win.
But in this case, he took advantage of that sort of looming presence, which could be conveyed as a kind of arrogance. What's this man doing standing over me, lording it over me? And he did his little jump. And that's what he was remembered for. So we're going to come back to what happened this year. But I want to just have a detour into British politics, because this is something that we got from you. We didn't used to have these debates. And the first one for a British general election was in 2010. So it's very late in the story, and it was always resisted, partly because the incentive structure was never right. As one candidate or one party thought they had more to lose, and the party that had most to gain was a little desperate. And so it took an election where both sides felt they had something to gain, which 2010 was. I'll come on to in a second. But also there was a feeling in a parliamentary system, maybe there wasn't such a need for it. These candidates had been duking it out in the House of Commons. Well, it was for a while twice a week, and then it became once a week at Prime Minister's Questions. Debate was part of the fabric of prime ministerial life in the way it isn't for a president, because a president is not a member of the legislature. So there was also a more principled objection to it. But in the end, principle went out the window and incentives came in. And in 2010, a bit like in 1976, both Gordon Brown and David Cameron were sort of underdogs, in the sense that Brown was prime minister, but he'd presided over the financial crisis, the beginnings of it, and it was at the fag end of the new Labour government, so there was a tired administration, and he really needed a bit of a miracle. But David Cameron was a relative unknown. He was young. He needed to introduce himself, though he'd been leader for 5 years, to as many of the electorate as he could. And so strongly incentivized were they that they were willing to allow a third candidate on the stage, Nick Clegg, the leader of the Liberal Democrats who polled decently at this point, but he was not plausibly going to be prime minister unless something really freakish happened, which it did in that debate, because it was a bit like in 1960, they weren't quite prepared. I think in this case, they hadn't quite thought it through. And something must have gone on in the two main camps where they thought, well, in a three-way debate, the one thing you really don't want is to be outnumbered 2 against 1 consistently. You don't want to be sort of boxed into a corner. So one way you can do this, and also to appeal to centrist voters, is to agree with the candidate in the middle, Nick Clegg, the Liberal Democrat. So the tagline of this, the only line that anyone remembers from this debate, is Cameron and Brown both repeatedly saying, I agree with Nick. That was the zinger. It was not much of a zinger. And no one can remember what Nick said. I couldn't tell you any of the things that Nick said, but I know they said, I agree with Nick. And it turned out all they succeeded in doing was boosting Nick Clegg, to the extent that there was a week, which is known in the annals of British politics as Cleggmania, where the Liberal Democrats were polling, in some polls, first. it suddenly became a three-way contest, a sort of 30-30-30 contest. And the thing that seemed inconceivable, that there might be a Liberal Democrat prime minister, was very briefly on the horizon until election day came around and reality kicked in. And the whole thing turned out to have been a kind of fluffy illusion. And the Liberal Democrats did no better than they'd done at the previous election. The debate had had almost no impact. And it felt like, as it so often does, that the campaign had a momentum and a trajectory that was almost set in stone. And the debate, which was an attempt to shift it by each of the different parties, made little or no difference. The one difference it did make is from then on, there was an expectation there would be a prime ministerial debate, which I don't think has been an enhancement of British democracy. I can't tell you hand on heart that the debates that I've seen have left me feeling better about the state of British democracy. And some of them have been fantastically dispiriting, including Keir Starmer versus Rishi Sunak this year. The ones involving Boris Johnson were pretty depressing. It's not been a great innovation for British politics. So thanks for that.
You're welcome. And we are ready to export many more aspects of American politics overseas. Just let us know what gifts you would like to receive first. Let me ask you this question about that 2010 election. If there had not been a debate of that sort, how would British politics have evolved differently, either in the election of 2010 or subsequently? I guess it would not have set a precedent for having debates, but it seems it did not make, in the end, it did not make a difference in the election itself. Is that correct? But if you can imagine, as a counterfactual, imagine that election without that debate, would it have followed the same course, or can you imagine it following a different course?
It's a great question. The result of that election was a rare event in British politics, a genuine coalition government. The Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats went into government together, and Nick Clegg became Deputy Prime Minister for that period, a semi-formalised role. It doesn't really have a constitutional place in British politics. And there was a coalition agreement. Now, it may be that the debate, Cleggmania briefly, and the experience of the moment where everyone agreed with Nick did something to enable that. And the coalition government has many critics, but it was surprisingly stable. So I'm not sure. There is at least a possibility, I think, that debate played a part, but it did also inflate expectations about the possibility of campaigns changing things, which aren't, I think, borne out. The format in British politics varies a lot. So there's now an expectation something has to happen on TV, but sometimes they won't be in the same room together. They take it in turns to be interrogated by an audience. You get different kinds of interviewers. The convention now is that leading journalists of the day, it's the same in the States, do it. But then there's a question, are they partisan? It's all got quite messy. I think the interesting consequence for British politics of the debates for Prime Minister is actually the fact that there have also been two very significant referendums in British politics in the last decade and a bit, the 2014 Scottish independence referendum and the 2016 Brexit referendum. And again, there was an expectation by that point that there would need to be debates. It's a question about, would they be party leader debates? Well, with Brexit, not really, because the main party leaders were all aligned for Remain. So then the question, who would be involved? Would it be Nigel Farage? Would it be Boris Johnson? In the Scottish case, Alex Salmond played a leading role, but then Alistair Darling rather than one of the leading Conservatives, because the Conservatives were so unpopular. And because these were referendums, debates did completely make sense. You want to argue out the issues. These were very important occasions. But by that point, we had reached the point that American politics had reached, which is these were occasions to avoid gaffes, if possible, land zingers, but mainly to avoid gaffes. And the question of who was debating whom was much more important than what was said, really, I think. It was about the personalities involved. It was about positioning yourself in these very important referendums by trying to get the right faces on the stage. Not an insignificant feature of these referendums. It was really important who was on which side. And these alliances had to be formed ad hoc because they didn't neatly follow party lines, certainly in the Brexit case. But the League of Women Voters, I think, would have had a good case for thinking these debates are going to be really important because this is a constitutional question. Brexit, what does it mean? What's going to happen? Which kind of Brexit are we going to get? What are the consequences of Remain? You didn't get an awful lot of League of Women Voters elevation of politics, in fact, I think.
Well, one question and then an observation. The question is, it's a League of Women Voters question. How do we get the debates we need? in this media environment. The intentions of the League of Women Voters are the right ones. The issues, the Scottish referendum, Brexit, my goodness, Britain needed very serious debates about this, and they got them in some form. But is this the pursuit of the Holy Grail? The search for a debate that's going to be worthy of the issues that have to be discussed and decided by the voting population? It remains an incredibly important question. How do we get there? That's my question. My observation about debates in the US versus debates in the UK, I think it's worth drawing attention to the difference between a presidential and a parliamentary system with British candidates rising through the party. They're generally better known to the general population than presidential candidates often are in the United States. The United States has a fascination with someone riding into town, a cowboy riding into town out of nowhere to clean things up, unsullied by the ordinary business of politics. We can point to so many candidates of this vintage: Trump, Obama, Carter. We haven't talked about Perot, but a significant force in the 1992 election. This affection for putting forward people who have not been corrupted by this awful game of politics. The tradition in British politics, I think, is different. There's just more respect for the parties, for the institutions. The manifesto of the respective parties has an importance in British politics that it has rarely had in the United States. So there is a need for a way to get to know these candidates riding into town and trying to take a measure of them. And perhaps that's more important in American politics than in British politics. I've been thinking, I'm not giving you the debates as being perhaps as bad an idea as you were imagining. So we don't have to agree on this. But if I think of what is a really bad idea of American politics and something that I admire about British politics, it's the 18-month long campaign that every presidential contender has to go through. The unending primary system, it's, to a certain extent, it's required by the decentralization of American politics and the need to win a certain number of states so as to get your party's nomination. But if you think of the cost of this, both psychically and in terms of money and funds required to sustain this, it opens the sluice gates, especially in light of the Supreme Court 2010 Citizens United decision that basically money coming into politics cannot be restrained. An 18-month campaign opens up its extraordinary ability for behind-the-scenes machinations of the moneyed interests and donors. And as I think about American politics, that to me seems like a very bad idea because it magnifies the possibilities for the worst sorts of corruption. And we're probably about to see a lot of that manifesting itself in the Trump administration, as those who gave huge amounts of money to Trump demand that they be paid off in the expectation that they would be. And my other reservation about this long campaign season is, what does running a campaign and running for office have to do with the actual art of governing? And so that in the U.S., there's so much emphasis on getting to the prize, getting to the Oval Office, and too little attention paid to what happens when an outsider actually gets there. For all of Obama's talents as a politician, nothing in his career prepared him for the magnitude of his responsibilities in the Oval Office. And he was overwhelmed at times, as deft and as talented a man as he was, by that challenge. And I think Trump was equally overwhelmed by the magnitude of the task when he took office in 2017. So there's some definitely bad ideas in American politics, which make the art of sustaining and resuscitating democracy difficult proposition.
Before we go too far in lauding the British alternative, as you were speaking a bit earlier about the need for outsider presidential candidates to be tested, we've just put out a conversation with Robert Saunders about something that's gone wrong with British politics, in which we spend quite a lot of time discussing Liz Truss. And indeed, in our last episode, I talk about her disastrous debate performances, which didn't prevent the members of the Conservative Party making her Prime Minister and then losing her as Prime Minister very shortly thereafter. From Boris Johnson to Liz Truss, and indeed in the age of Jeremy Corbyn, there's been more outsideriness to British politics, and debates have not done a good job of either testing or exposing that. On your question of what debate should we have, it's not an entirely flippant answer. What about on the podcasts? I would love to have heard Trump and Harris together on Joe Rogan, and then Trump and Harris together on Call Me Daddy. Why not? I don't think it could be less instructive, especially over a long period. And the intimacy of the podcast format and the wide rambling nature of it. So it's not just about tightly controlled and scripted and very short answers, or the answers are all very short on televised debates. You can ramble on as long as you like. I think that might be more revealing. Who knows? Last question. 2024, there was a very consequential debate. You've touched on it. Not Harris-Trump, but Biden-Trump, in which Biden was exposed, and it did cost him his presidency, no question. It was because of that debate that he ended up standing down. And I believe the conspiracy theory. So I believe that some of the people around him put him out then in order to force that outcome, or at least there were forces at work, because people must have been aware that this was something that was at serious risk of happening. Let's put it like that. Not inevitable, but anyone who'd worked with Biden recently must have known that this debate could expose him. And therefore, I think some people saw this as an opportunity to force the issue. And this is my last argument against these debates being a bad idea. That's a terrible way to do it, right? They should have, if they needed him out, they needed to get him out sooner because the damage was done by that point. The other thing in doing that, to force out your candidate and get someone else in, you boost the other guy. And it may well be that one of the things that happened this year is there were two debates, and the one that stuck in people's minds actually was the Biden one. I mean, there's something about that really lodged, and it didn't just lodge that Biden was not up to it, but Trump was okay. And if that was the device that was used to prize Joe Biden out of the candidacy and Oval Office, that was very counterproductive.
Well, it could have been worse. I don't think we know the inner workings. So your conspiracy is that some of his handlers put him out there to expose him.
Or if not his handlers, nonetheless, some of the significant players in the Democratic Party saw this, because the debate was very early.
Yes.
Unusually early, actually. Saw this as an opportunity to force the issue. I think I wouldn't put it stronger than forcing the issue.
Yeah. I mean, the other possibility is that his handlers were themselves engaged in self-deception, that they thought, we've been with Joe a long time. We know he's ailing, but he can get through this. Certainly against Trump, he had performed well in 2020. When I said it could have been worse, it's never happened. I don't think that a debate occurred this early in the presidential season. June, there's never, I don't think, been debates before September in previous presidential elections. And imagine if they had not opted for this. And this early debate was not at Trump's request, it was at the Biden team's request, which may support your conspiracy theory, but they all already knew that things were going south and they thought that this could stop the bleeding. But imagine if that debate had not occurred in June. Imagine if it had occurred in September.
Wow, Trump might have won and the Republicans might have won the trifecta. I mean, it's I take your point. It could have been, I suppose, more catastrophic, but it feels to me like if it was a gamble in June, it really did backfire.
Yes, but it would have come in September. And I think that some of the behind the scenes negotiating and concerns that were going on, and what I think finally prompted Nancy Pelosi and other heavyweights in the party to try and pull the plug on Biden, was their concern about down ballot losses. In other words, they expected Biden to lose, and they probably expected someone nominated in his place to lose because so little time was left and there was no way Harris could get out from under Biden's shadow. But even though the Republican Party took the House and the Senate, the expectations of losses in June and July were much greater than what actually happened. And so there may have been a way in which the Democratic Party preserved a larger part of itself, which may help it with future battles. But to your larger point, that debate in June was a debacle for the Democratic Party. And there's going to have to be an accounting and a reckoning with how a party came to put itself in that position of vulnerability, especially given the deep antagonism in the party toward Trump and everything that he represented in terms of threats to democracy and the authoritarian peril that the Democratic Party saw as him manifesting at every turn. How it came to be that the Democratic Party put itself in that position, there's going to have to be a very serious reckoning with that before the Democratic Party figures out its way forward.
So I guess if these are bad ideas, and I take your point that you're not completely sold on the thought they are I have to concede that they're bad ideas that are quite good at flushing out bad ideas, because that's what happened in this case.
We can agree on that. And as to your point about having Harris and Trump sit down with Joe Rogan, the sentiment behind that idea, I agree with, that we have to work through the media we have. We can't ignore it and pretend it doesn't matter. The only way, and this is a message to the League of Women Voters, the silent heroes of our conversation here are not going to appreciate hearing, we can't turn back the clock to an earlier media environment. If democracy is going to have to flourish, it's going to have to flourish through the new media environment in which we live.
I really hope you've enjoyed this History of Bad Ideas series. I don't think the bad ideas are going to run out. There are lots of them that we haven't covered, and we'll be doing more at some point in 2025. A reminder that the latest edition of our newsletter is out. It came out on Friday, and it accompanies the previous 4 episodes in this series. It's free. To sign up, just click on the link in the show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com. And don't forget, there is also a bonus episode now available to accompany this series. It's a conversation between me and the historian of ideas, Lucia Rubinelli, about what's gone wrong with the idea of sovereignty. To get that and all of our bonus episodes and ad-free listening, just sign up to PPF Plus. The link is in the show description. All the details are on our website. Coming next, we are resuming the series that we paused while we went into the bad ideas, the great political films. And we're going to take that one right up to the present day. We start again at the end of the 1960s with one of the greatest of all political films, Z. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books. Past, Present, Future is part of the Airwave podcast network.